What's happening, my people? It's your boy Night God here. Look, if you haven't heard of Anchor by Spotify, let me give you the rundown. Basically, it's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Here's how it works. Anchor lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter where you are or what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you'll take that podcast and distribute it to the most popular listening platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts, with a single click. Anchor is also the only place you can publish video podcasts to Spotify. With Anchor, creators can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free. So download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to start your podcasting adventure today. It was his first voyage, and everything was going handsomely, as Sinbad and the merchants he had contracted with had made several stops along the coast and exchanged and traded goods. At this point in the journey, they had touched at several islands, because that's where many of the ports lie at which they traded at. So it wasn't uncommon for them, in between trading, to anchor at these islands and take breaks, eat food, and rest. And it was on this day during the voyage that they set out to do just that. After a successful morning of bartering at the port, Sinbad was peering over the water, pondering over the success of his recent venture. As he fixated his gaze forward, he noticed what seemed to be a small island about even with the water. Perfect timing, he thought. I'm sure the crew is just as ready for a break as I am. So he arranged for the captain to steer towards the island where they would anchor, and many of them would go to shore. And they couldn't believe it when they got there. It was green and lush, almost like the grass you would see in a field. Though they were somewhat enamored by the condition of the island, the men brushed it off and proceeded to make camp, where they were going to build fires and eat. So with that, they broke up into groups of 3 or 4, and each of them with wood from the ship began to make fires. Just as they had finished prepping their meals, the entire island trembled. A sense of fear coursed through the men's body like wildfire. Their hair stood up on end, and they looked at each other with wide eyes. Whatever it was trembled so much so that it vibrated the water all the way out to the ship. As they looked out, it was apparent they were seeing something the men on the island weren't, as they were calling them out to the ship frantically. The island seemed to raise up another 5 or 10 feet. As it was doing this, they were jumping off into the water. It was at this point that they all realized they weren't on an island. They were on a living creature. Sinbad the sailor had heard legends of this before, but he never thought them to be true. Legends of a whale so massive that it'd be mistaken for an island. According to lore that dated back at the time several hundred years, just after the death of Christ, the beast would fall asleep, and when it would sleep, it would float to the surface of the water. This, coupled with the beast being so old, over that time, it had grown a seaweed-like grassy substance on the top of its back. It was even said that it had large patches of crustaceans and coral that grew on it over the years, and this would make it look like mountains or even sometimes sand. So sailors would see it out in the middle of the ocean thinking it was a random island. Sometimes they'd even slam large spikes into its flesh in order to anchor their ship to it. But in the end, what would always disturb it the most was the fires started by the sailors. Over the years, it had claimed thousands of ships. The ones anchored to it were especially unlucky, as it would drag the entire ship to the bottom with it. Many legends measured it at 200 to 300 cubits, a cubit equaling 1.5 feet. But as it dove with Sinbad the sailor on its back, he realized that estimate fell way short. Luckily, before it submerged, he was able to grab one of the logs that they were using for the fire. As the beast dove, it created a massive wave and an even meaner wind. Because of the logs, Sinbad didn't get drawn down with the whale, but the gale force winds his ship captain took advantage of and actually set his sail and pushed away from the beast, leaving Sinbad behind. He had gathered himself after the initial onslaught of waves from the whale. He fought with the waves all that day and the following night. The next morning, he had lost all strength and was about to give up hope when he woke up being washed ashore to an island. As the waves threw him against the island, he peered up, and it was a steep ledge, but luckily there were some roots that aided him in getting up on the island. Starving, dehydrated, and weak, He flopped out on the grass for several minutes, but eventually he began to move and gather herbs and fruits to eat, and then found a clear water spring. He drank himself back to health and started wandering the island, where he came to an open field and spotted a beautiful horse. He made his way towards it when suddenly somebody from down below says, "Hey, what are you doing here?" He gave the gentleman his account, of which the gentleman was absolutely dumbfounded. But he believed him. He proceeded to tell Sinbad that he was the King Mirage's groomers, that every year they brought the horses to this part of the island to graze and feed, that if he was just hours later, he would have missed them. The next morning, he left with those men, and they went back to the city on their island. There was a large port. Sinbad spent the next couple weeks there, watching out or listening for any word from Baghdad or his crew. While there, he took it all in and learned their customs, and also they learned his. He often found himself in the company of the king and his understudies. After a couple days of being there, he learned of a certain island that the king owned, known as Cassel Island. They claimed that at night you could hear cymbals or drums being played from the island by a spirit. So the next day he embarked to the island. He didn't see anything strange or of the sort, but he did see fish that he claimed were 100 and 200 cubits in length. That's 200 and 300 feet in length. Luckily, he said, they were more afraid of them than they were of the fish. If you even struck two sticks together, they would swim away in fear. He said he also saw fish that were only 1 cubit in length, but had the heads of owls. He was amazed at what he saw on the island that day. But when he got back from the island, back to port, he noticed a ship that looked familiar. They were throwing bales off the ship that had his initials on them. Sure enough, it was his ship and the merchant that left him in the water that day. He told him the story, and eventually the merchant did recognize him and gave him all of his goods back, to which he traded to the king for exchange of many more goods. On his way back home, he traded and made all kinds of money. He arrived at Bilsara and went to Baghdad with 100,000 quins. He bought everything his family needed and set up for a couple of years, of which he enjoyed life and lived lavishly. But as always, he became restless and seemingly forgot all the trials and tribulations he went through on the first voyage. He went down to the Balsora port and paid some merchants and started to get ready for his second voyage. His second voyage filled with even more trials and tribulations, but that's going to be for next time. So make sure you stay tuned and watch. It's coming soon. And after doing some research, his account of the devil whale, they actually do line up with many stories throughout history, from even dating back as far as AD 79. I found this while researching said whale. According to myths, this whale is of enormous size and can swallow entire ships. It also resembles an island when it's sleeping, and unsuspecting sailors put ashore on its back. When the sailors start a fire, the devil whale wakes up and attacks the ship, dragging it to the bottom of the sea. Because of this, Christianity began associating the whale with the devil. The incident of the whale island on Sinbad's first voyage from Baghdad to Basra may be compared with whales described by Pliny the Elder, 29 AD to 79 AD, and Sulinus covering for Jugera and the priestess sea monster of the same authority, 200 cubits long. El-Kazwini tells a similar tale of a colossal tortoise. Such Eastern stories are probably the original of the whale island in the Irish travel romance of Saint Brandon. In his travels, he reportedly landed on the back of a gigantic whale on Easter Sunday, mistaking it for an island. Soon as his monks started a fire to cook their meal, the island began to swim away and the sailors quickly scrambled back to their boats. Then we have Guillaume le Cleric, but this one monster, very treacherous and dangerous. In Latin, its name is Cetus. It is a bad neighbor for sailors. The upper part of its back looks like sand, and when it rises from the sea, the mariners think it's an island. Deceived by its size, they sail towards it for refuge when the storm comes upon them. They cast anchor, disembark upon the back of the whale, cook their food, build a fire, and in order to fasten their boat, they drive great stakes into what seems to them sand. When the monster feels the heat of the fire, which burns upon its back, it plunges down into the depths of the ocean and drags the ship and all the people with it. Crazy stuff, right? Now, does this mean it's true? Absolutely not. It could all be mythology and lore. It could all be stories that have been passed down from generation to generation. Now, I like to think that it's possible that there's a little truth within mythology, but it's not always the case. Regardless, for entertainment purposes only, may or may not be true. Provide the information, let you decide. Now, I would like to see what you guys had to say in the comments about this. What do y'all think? Is it possible that at one time we had creatures this big in the ocean? Is it possible? Who knows? For those that think they know and want to call people crazy, you simply don't at the end of the day. So, I hope you enjoyed it. As always, stay in the love, stay in the light, be kind to others, treat them how you want to be treated, and stay tuned. These voyages only get better. Keep watching, y'all. I am out.